Welcome to the Marketing Meeting podcast. My guest today is Carl Driesener. Carl is a senior marketing scientist at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute for Marketing Science for over 15 years. Welcome to the show, Carl. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Ita.
My first question is, I recognize that the time zone difference between New York and Adelaide, South Australia, is 15 and a half hours. It's the first time that I'm having 15 and a half hours. How come is that?
Oh, yeah. Well, because I think, time zone sort of starts just east of New Zealand. So New Zealand is one of the first countries in the world to greet it's not the first, but it's one of the first. There's some islands out there which get the New Year's first. So you got New Zealand, then you get Australia, you get the East Coast and the mid where I am. I'm in Adelaide, which is the middle of Australia. Then you get the West Coast and it progresses around. And so New York is more than 180 degrees around the other side past Adelaide. So you've got Adelaide, and directly opposite Adelaide would be 12 hours difference. But then New York obviously is a bit past that, if you look at it in a strictly geometric sense. But then, of course, time zones are a bit weird. So New York could, in fact, be the other side of it. It's just because time zones are weird.
Well, I mean, it's the first time that I'm seeing a half an hour,
the half hour.
Half hours.
Yeah, that's Adelaide.
That's the question.
Sorry, the Adelaide. The half hour is Adelaide. We do because Australia is a very big country, east-west. It's basically the width of the continental United States. That Adelaide is a city that if we sort of stuck with one time zone or the other, it'd be quite weird for us. So we have this extra half hour.
Interesting.
So that's Adelaide, that part.
Yeah, but it's unique. There's a unique positioning of Adelaide.
It's something to remember us by, exactly.
Exactly.
Part of our branding.
Yeah. I would like to start with a question on brand equity. And maybe for listeners who are not familiar with this term, brand equity is the value that a brand adds to a product or a service beyond the functional benefits that it provides. And one of my most important tasks as a marketing leader is to increase brand equity whenever possible. And the marketing is the key driver of that. However, quantifying that brand equity is always the challenge of a brand marketer. What are the methods, or how can we calculate the brand equity?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And effectively, it is one of those things, like a lot of things, that resides in the minds of consumers, and not just one consumer, but millions of consumers. So you've got this difficulty. There's a lot of constructs we have in marketing, which sort of sound nice and sound easy, like brand equity sounds quite easy to measure, but it's actually enormously complicated. And it is fundamentally something about consumer research. So you absolutely have to go to consumers to find that out. And we think of brand equity at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute a little bit differently. We think that the value for the brand is understanding how that brand is linked to key category moments. And the key category moments are things which bring people into the category to make their next purchase. And so from our perspective, we refer to those as category entry points. And it's the next purchase, not the first purchase, because people only buy a category the first time once. It is the first purchase, and it's the second, the third, the fourth. It's just the next purchase. What's the thing that somebody comes into the category for? Why are they buying the category? And is your brand linked to it? And if your brand is linked to that reason in the minds of millions of consumers, then when that thing happens, you've got an opportunity to come to mind, which increases your chances of being bought when somebody walks into a store. Because obviously, the store or a purchase environment, I shouldn't just use the word store, I tend to, but when they're in any purchase environment, have you come to mind beforehand increases the chances you get purchased. Doesn't guarantee. There are no guarantees in marketing. It's a numbers game. It's a probability game. So brand equity for us is really about those linkages between the brand and key category moments, and measuring that still is a consumer question, but relatively straightforward once you've identified a suitable set of category moments. So what are these category entry points? What are the things that bring somebody into the category? Is it a treat for self? Is it something for the whole family? Is it something to have at work? Is it something to have after work? Is it something for my friends? What is it? What are those set of things? And then how well does your brand perform across them?
Mm-hmm. So would it be in terms of specific methods? Is it through surveys or research or some other methods that top of mind and surveys and so on? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, top of mind. top of mind awareness is one of those interesting things. It's kind of a measure of brand equity, but not a very good one. It's a very blunt instrument. It assumes that people think of the category and then think of the brand, which may or may not happen. What we're interested in is, and also it assumes the category is the initial prompt, but there's actually a prompt before the category, and the prompt before the category are these category entry points. Like I need a pick-me-up and a treat for myself. And so if you identify what those things are, and that in itself is a piece of consumer research, and it is kind of like a bit of an in-depth qual type interview, because you really want to unpack 60, 80, 100 people's experiences of a category. How does that category intersect with their lives? Why have they made those purchases? What are they doing with them? How did it make them feel? All these sorts of questions. And from those, we can identify potential category entry points. So that's like an elicitation process. And then we have a quantification process where we take those category entry points and we say, for this category entry point, which brands come to mind? And it's that process is really quite simple. And it's which brands come to mind. That it's a pick any approach. So here's a list of brands, pick one and tell us. And you can pick more than one. So people do actually quite often pick more than one. So of these brands, which, if any, come to mind, I should be a little bit more explicit there about the nature of the question. But it is, you're completely right. It's 100% a consumer piece of research. And I think a lot of marketers would do well to remember there's a lot of value in understanding the consumer mind.
Yeah, and also there is not, it's not a method at the end of the day, but I really like also the price point as a basis. If it's exactly very similar products at the same marketplace trying to sell to the same consumer, but one is higher than the other, then it already gives a kind of a brand equity understanding. And if that brand is anyway price, both voiced by some people.
Yeah, price can give a quality type indicator. And quality isn't generally what we refer to as a category entry point. I mean, it could be, but generally it's not, because you're not buying the category to buy a quality product. You're buying the category for something else. And then maybe picking between brands comes down to a quality question. I want the high quality one or the more price premium one. And price point's really interesting. When you look at how people buy across price points over time, the same consumer can buy cheap and cheerful, they can buy expensive, and they can just buy mid-range prices as well. And so you do get people buying across all price tiers. There is interesting that in a manner you'd expect, there is some isolation between low and high price. If you buy a high price, you're a bit less likely to buy low, but not completely unlikely, and vice versa. But everyone buys into the happy middle quite happily.
I feel the brand equity, or usually when I go to CVS, which is just around the corner. For example, if I want to buy a paracetamol, CVS has its own brands, and they say like, this is exactly the same ingredient that you can find in a Tylenol, for example, just like another brand in paracetamol. And then the Tylenol brand is itself like probably $2 more than a CVS brand, which is exactly the same thing. But I mean, I go and buy Tylenol because maybe it's like there's like a psychological effect that it's going to cure my headache better than a CVS one.
Potentially. And there's also a blinker effect that before you've walked into the store, you've got the headache, which is why you're going to take the Tylenol or for something like that. And you've thought of Tylenol, you haven't thought of CVS brand. And so you think of Tylenol, you walk into the store, there's people all around, you've got to fight your way through them and avoid them and like not walk into things. And you're really focused on getting in and out of that store efficiently and effectively. And so you screen out an enormous amount of things. You get to the shelf, you don't even see the CVS. You're like, there's a Tylenol, grab it, and you get out. Because you've got the kids in the car, or you've got to get to work, or you've got to go meet your friend for coffee. And that's what you're thinking about. You're not trying to find the cheapest.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And also, like for example, for me as a consumer, it's like if I want to find the best brand in that category, I check the CVS product, and then on the package they write which brand they are comparing it to, which is the best brand. Yeah, that's how I do and I go and pick that one.
Yeah.
Anyway,
well, actually, interestingly, we would say in marketing, never mention the competition. And I've actually met some marketers like that who are ferocious competitors, and they will never, even just in a casual conversation, say the name of their competition. And I love that.
Well, yeah. Like here's like a great real example of that.
Exactly.
From there, I'm going to narrow it down and move to brand image, because I know that you have a study titled Comparing Methods of Brand Image.
Yep.
So when we say brand image, for example, when we talk about brand equity, Apple is a great example of strong brand equity. But when you think about Apple's brand image, it's more of like simplicity, innovation is
Yep.
the image.
Yep.
Well, in a very simple way. Can you, for brands seeking to understand their brand image in the market, can you talk about which measurement methods are there available for brands and like the upsides and downsides of each of them?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, there are three measurement methods. There's the classic Likert scale on a 7-point or a 5-point scale from low to high. Which of these brands, or do you agree or disagree or strongly agree that this brand displays this particular image? There's sort of ranking, which is you take the brands and you say, of these 6 brands, can you please rank them in order of which ones display this particular image item the most, and down to the least, so you can rank them, or maybe rank the top 3, because ranking all 6 can be a bit of a nightmarish task. And then there's another method called the pick any task, which is, here's a list of brands, just tick the ones that you think display this image. And that's the one we typically go for. And oddly enough, I actually did some research in this space quite some time ago, comparing the 3 methods. So do you get similar outputs from the 3? To the extent you can compare sort of a scale, a rank, and a pick any. Like when you order the brands from the responses, when you look at how people use those scales, do you see similar patterns? And you see very strong similarities between them. So they're giving pretty much, they're all quite reliable. They're all measuring pretty much the same thing. But pick any tends to be a lot quicker. And so what we see is when you measure how long it takes people to use a pick any battery, here's 40 attributes and here's 6 brands, link these 6 brands to the 40 attributes. Pick any takes about half the time, which is really quite important because it saves you time in the questionnaire and saves you respondent fatigue as well, which I think is really quite important and allows you to add some other things in there. But not only that, it actually probably reflects what goes on in people's heads a little bit too. Like we've got the system 1 and system 2, we can be very rational and think our way through things, and we can make very quick decisions, and we recall things, and we make the good enough decision, the satisfice. We don't look for the perfect decision very often because it takes too much energy and effort. We just look for what lets me solve my problem right now and get on with my life, because like before, the kid's in the car or the kids are squawking right now or to catch my friends up. So I'm going to solve my problem and get on with it. So I find the first good enough solution to move on. I don't look for the best. So ranking and rating is kind of like you're exploring your memory, you're interrogating your memory networks, you're really putting a big, heavy effort into making this decision. Whereas pick any is, did it come to mind or not? If it came to mind, that's actually good enough. Because if it comes to mind before you have the experience of the purchase environment, again, you've massively increased the chances you get bought because you'll be found on shelf much more quickly. So we use the pick any and really like the pick any method.
For once we use the pick any method and we come up with some brand image and associations that our brand is related with. What's the next step on that? I mean, like, is it like we just compare it with the industry competition so that we decide which brand image, which lever we're gonna?
Yeah. So context really matters, and brand image. Brand associations, there are some associations we think that matter a lot more than others. And so the associations that, in my view, matter the most are the branding devices themselves. Can you find that product in the purchase environment? And when you see a piece of creative, can you identify who paid for that creative? And so those associations, those branding devices are absolutely critical. The next set of branding associations I care about, or brand associations I care about, are the CEPs, the category entry points. For the network of associations or those things that bring you into the category, how well linked is the brand to those things? And then there's all the other stuff. So the quality perceptions and all those other brand associations. So that sort of hierarchy, I think, is really quite valuable and really important. So for me, some of those associations become much less important in the process of being purchased, because most of our purchase decisions in very disparate categories and categories you'd be quite surprised about are really quick and efficient and looking for the good enough solution, not the perfect solution.
Yeah, we always, like marketers, always assume that we are thinking about the perfect association, which is like,
Exactly.
it's sometimes just good enough, especially when you think about FMCG, where like you enter a market, a supermarket, and it's just
Yeah.
like tons of products.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. But it's actually not just FMCG either. I mean, if you ask people questions about financial products or big expensive products like motor vehicles, you see a lot of the same sorts of patterns. Like it's really interesting when you look at loyalty to motor vehicles and loyalty to instant coffee. It's actually quite similar. And so what that indicates is people are purchasing vehicles and FMCG in a very similar manner. So to then say, well, motor vehicles is much more considered, it's just a longer time period between purchasing. And when you look at financial products, the amount of banks that people talk to when they go to get a home loan, surprisingly few.
oh, okay. Interesting. But I haven't thought about the FMCG versus even like a car
Yeah.
buying behavior. There's one quote that I've been thinking about this last week. It was about Warren Buffett.
Yep.
And he said that pricing power is the most important factor when evaluating a business for himself or to invest and so on.
Yep.
And we know that pricing power is very much correlated with the brand equity and brand image as well. What's the way to assess pricing power? Because like this is the question that I have in my mind. Okay, how do we, is there a method to do that? Or like, and then once we know that, what's the way to enhance that? Which is like a broader question, but I'm going to
That's
first of all
complicated.
I'm just going to ask the assessment part, maybe if you have anything at the Institute working on this.
Yeah, so in terms of pricing power, not so much, but it's actually quite interesting to look at what Warren said. And he is an absolute legend in the investing space, and he is famous for making some very high value investments. And what's important to remember, of course, is his perception of value does not mean cheap. It means it's going to deliver good value in the future, which could actually be either end. Sometimes we get caught up in that idea of value being cheap, and absolutely not. And he said this quite interesting thing. The most important decision in evaluating a business is pricing power. If you've got the power to raise prices without losing business to competitors, i.e. without losing sales, you've got a very good business. And so what he's talking about there is exactly pricing power. The way we would refer to that is price elasticity. So it's that relationship between a price increase and a sales decrease, or a price decrease and a sales increase. So absolutely, we can measure price elasticity, and it's pretty straightforward. It's for a given percentage change in price, what's the percentage change in sales? And usually it's a negative relationship. There's not too many categories, though education is probably one where price goes up and people keep wanting to buy, more people want to buy it. But we do see mostly that economic relationship of higher price leads to lower sales. Now, there are some cases where that's a bit less so, and I think the point, obviously trying to interpret what the maestro is saying is interesting. But he sort of says, in that quote, he makes the point there's some ones where you never have to think, you can just raise price and get more, not lose sales. And at the other end, if you have to think about even just tiny manipulations in your price, and that's going to cost you sales, he's talking about the extremes. I mean, and he's kind of making a point there. I would imagine, not having ever talked to him, that he recognises that actually most businesses fall somewhere in between. And he's probably looking at, for your category, do you have greater or lower price elasticity? And price elasticity is really interesting.
But I mean, when you calculate price elasticity, you mentioned that, okay, if once we increase the price, what's the drop in sales? That's the, or like what's the increase in, if you have increase in sale, which is like even better.
So that was when you price promote and you drop your price temporarily, that's a drop in price. What's the increase in sales we get?
But I mean, can you just calculate it in a short-term period also, like, or you have to see the trend over the longer term?
Yeah, you probably,
when you calculate that.
Yeah, you'd probably want to you're not going to look at it for last week. You probably really want to look at it for the last 6 months or the last 12 months. I mean, back to a point you made earlier, you sort of made that point, the marketers think consumers always look for the perfect decision and the perfect answer. The vast bulk of our time, we just trying to solve our problem and get on with our life. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about stuff, which actually means it's quite hard to change what's in people's minds. Like, it takes a long, continual effort to do so. So if you're looking at price elasticity for last week, yeah, that'll probably give you a good indicator of where you're at, but you probably want to look at it a little bit over the long term as well, I think. And quite interesting, there's some clear rules of thumb. The answer is about -2.5. So you raise price by about 1%, you typically lose about 2.5% of sales. And what's interesting is and I haven't seen data in a lot of non-FMCG categories, but with inflationary price rises over the last couple of years, in FMCG, where prices have gone up, absolutely you see volume declining, but value sales is maintained because you're now making more money. What's interesting is when you look at the consumer base, who are you losing? And you tend to see loyalty increases because you're losing light buyers, and that's a big problem. Light buyers are enormously important to the brand, and so we can see brands volume down, value flat, price up, loyalty a little bit up because they're losing light buyers, which then becomes an issue for later on. And there's some interesting findings around how you can manipulate the price elasticity. It's not fixed. It is really context dependent. Things like bigger brands tend to have lower price elasticities, and brands with higher loyalty tend to have lower price elasticities, which is kind of saying the same thing, because bigger brands tend to have higher loyalty as well. It's one of the interesting findings when you look at consumer behaviour. And loyalty in this context has been behavioural loyalty. There's an enormous academic debate about attitudinal loyalty and behavioural loyalty. At the end of the day, I care about behavioural loyalty because business cares about behavioural loyalty, because behavioural loyalty is somebody reaching out in a purchase environment, grabbing a product, dropping it into whatever their basket is, and handing over cold hard cash. Attitudinal loyalty is, oh yeah, I really like that brand, I'd love to buy it, but I never do. So who really cares about attitudinal loyalty? I mean, it's nice, but it's that behavioural loyalty that really matters. And so we see bigger brands get higher behavioural loyalty. They tend to have lower price elasticities, both up and down. So they also don't benefit quite as much from a price drop.
Because I have a further question about brand loyalty, but now since we are already talking about that, because I know, do you think brand loyalty overall in the industry is overstated?
Loyalty absolutely matters. And when I say loyalty, I mean behavioural loyalty. I'm not talking about attitudinal loyalty. Loyalty absolutely matters, but it's one of those things when you look at competing brands, we see some differences in loyalty. So bigger brands get a bit more loyalty and smaller brands get a little bit less loyalty. But loyalty is quite consistent between brands. It's not like some brands have really high loyalty and some brands have really low loyalty. The big difference between competing brands is how many consumers they've got that buy them at all. So bigger brands can have 20, 30, 40 times as many consumers and 50%, maybe 100% more loyalty. So as you grow, you're getting more loyalty. But if you want to grow, you don't focus on loyalty, you focus on getting more consumers. Because if you focus on loyalty, you say to someone, grow your loyalty, they're going to go, oh, well, I've got to get my existing buyer base to buy me more often. And yeah, you're not wrong, but that way failure lies. If you want to grow, you need to double the size of your buyer base. That's how you're going to grow. And as you do that, as you engage in activities that allow you to get more consumers, it will also help build loyalty. So there's some really, really interesting findings in that space. And I think it's just worth just finishing off one thing on the pricing power thing. At the end of the day, pricing power is somewhat transitory. Pricing power comes from some product feature. Sometimes there's a bit of a brand element in there, but it's really about the product and those sorts of things. And that stuff ultimately gets copied. So if you've got a pricing power moment where you have pricing power, where you should take price, but you've got to invest that money in building the brand because the brand itself, people can't copy.
Yeah. When I think about pricing power, two brands come to my mind and they are kind of different. In one sense, one of them is, again, Apple.
Yeah.
It has a pricing power. I mean, like you're just going to pay $100 more for the new iPhone. That's okay. Compared to competition brand, which is like the Google phone or whatever, Androids and so on. But when I think about, for example, Amazon, which like they are, their power is to decrease the prices as much as possible. Yeah. But it's just like the dilemma that I have with the pricing power.
Yeah, I mean, it can go both ways. You can absolutely, and Amazon's kind of an interesting case, which we might come back to, but Apple is definitely a higher premium priced items, and premium products exist and they do really well, and Apple's done an amazingly good job of building an enormous consumer base, and they actually get slightly more loyalty than brands which are smaller. But the interesting thing I find about Apple is it has a really complicated ecosystem and a very extensive and pervasive ecosystem, which a lot of people benefit from. So you've got iCloud, you've got the App Store, you've got a huge amount of support services that go with their products. And for me, and that stuff is really cheap. And for me, that's recognition by Apple that, you know what, people will swap and switch their brands really easily. They're not that attached to their iPhone. It's nice and it's functional, it looks cool and all those things. But like you say, Samsung does the same thing. So it's easy to switch. Let's make that a little bit harder by building a very nice, happy ecosystem. So for me, the Apple ecosystem is not because Apple's a nice company. It's because Apple recognizes the limits on its brand user loyalty. So yeah, premium brands can really be big and successful, and you can also make a lot of money by being cheap and cheerful, which is what Amazon does. And they allow other brands to build an area and then build their Amazon private label and dominate that area.
Yeah. Your team at the Institute emphasizes a lot about mental and physical availability, which I'm going to start with the mental availability first, because that's crucial for brand growth. How can brands maintain this mental availability, especially thinking about this today's fast-paced digital environment?
Yep.
How is that evolving in today's world?
Yeah. So mental availability is about what's going on in people's minds. And from our perspective, as I was saying before, that is, there are a number of reasons why people are buying a category. How well linked is your brand to those reasons? And those linkages in memory happen because people have experienced the brand in the context of that category entry point. And so that could be their usage. They've used the brand in that, like, I needed a treat for myself, so I bought this chocolate bar, or I bought that drink, or I bought that nice perfume as a treat for myself. Or they've seen other people do the same thing, or even advertising. So advertising can build those linkages. It's just advertising is not a particularly powerful force. It doesn't switch people's behavior from black to white. It just nudges them in the direction you want them to go. So it's reinforcing things that people have seen before. But it can build those linkages. It can build that link between a particular category entry point and a brand. But those linkages are the result of people's life, their experience, their exposure to marketing, their exposure to the product, their experience of the category, and all those sorts of things. And it does take a long time to build and develop, but it can fade. Memory fades. So advertising is about just reminding and refreshing people that, hey, you need a treat for yourself. We're a brand that will provide you that in the context of this category. Or you want something for the whole family, we provide you that particular feature as well. So it's just reminding people about those particular linkages. So the role of advertising and marketing is mostly reminding people about things they know already and occasionally adding something new to it. It's not always about something new. Mm-hmm. And so, yep, please.
No, I mean, because whenever I talk about mental availability with someone, the first question that they say, okay, it's just through the ads. That's it, because you have to remind and be there in front of them. But then they question, okay, people are skipping ads. They are putting ad blocks to digital, or it's just like, how are we doing that? So fundamentally, what's your take on that?
Fundamentally, what you're trying to do as a marketer has not changed. It hasn't changed in the last 60 years because the human brain hasn't changed in the last 60 years. Now, the way you can nudge and affect memory and have an influence on people's decisions in the future, which is what we're trying to do through affecting memory, that changes. So the media has changed. The purchase environments have changed radically. It used to be you'd walk into a store and you'd say to the storekeeper, who was a storekeeper dressed in the white outfit, can I have that product, please? And they go, yeah, sure. How much of that would you like? They'd reach up, pull it off the shelf and give it to you. That purchase environment now is you can click on something on a digital screen and it turns up at your house half an hour later. So the mechanism of delivery, the mechanism of how we deliver products and ads can be wildly different, but fundamentally it's the same thing. People have always avoided advertising. It's not just advertising. It's kind of like we screen stuff out. We screen everything out. The people who are listening to this podcast at some point, you're walking, maybe sometimes you're sitting down listening to this podcast. The whole time you've been sitting down or the whole time you've been walking, as you've been walking, you've been feeling the earth and the planet under your feet and you've ignored it. For the people who are sitting down listening to the podcast, the whole time you've been sitting down, you've felt your chair under your backside and on your back, and you've ignored it. You've screened those things out. We are great at screening stuff out and focusing on the things that care to us. So, yeah, people screen ads out all the time, but they've always screened ads out. They've screened it out digitally, they screen it out on TV, they screen it out on the radio, they screen it out in newspapers, but it's still valuable because it's still, if it's well branded, has a potential to have a good impact, a positive impact.
Mm-hmm. Because I mean, like, it's at the end of the day, for me, it's the marketer's job to find methods about mental availability. So we know that it works because you have to remind that the brand still exists.
Yes.
And we are bringing new stuff and new innovation to the market, and act as if you are like still owning that space.
Yeah.
And that's a marketer's job. And marketer's job is not only doing advertising.
That's right. Yeah.
It's which advertising is anyway, most of the time for especially B2C brands, that's a big amount of the media spend, of the marketing spend. But it's our job to make sure either it's through influencer marketing or through community building or grassroots activities or whatever is that, or sponsorships.
Yep.
Then we have to figure that out. And the next one is, we're going to say something?
I was just going to say, those other things like building communities and sponsorships and all those sort of things can be valuable, but you've got to look at them in cold hard numbers of how many people do I reach with this activity. And reaching people, and not just people generally, but people that might buy the category. I mean, you've got to reach into that audience. And if you're not reaching that audience, you've got a problem because you're limiting your potential to sell. Because regardless of how good your product is, a little bit category dependent, people will still buy competitor products.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that, like a very short side note, is that I started my first marketing role as a running brand manager in Turkey, where the people who were running was about like 3%. And it was mainly walking, actually.
Yeah.
And then we started these run clubs, which is like grassroots, completely like no one was running, and people were clapping if you are running with two people. You know, can you imagine?
So a little community. I like it.
Yeah, but I mean, no one was running. But then we have all these grassroots community, university, not community, but the university clubs and so on. And slowly, people started to run because they see the benefits of that. And it started to be like the cool new thing.
And you've made it easier. You've made it easier. And that's probably it's partly a communication piece, but it's partly what I'd refer to as physical availability, that you've made it easy for people to engage in the activity or to buy the product or enter the purchase environment because it's now right next to them. So they're at university or they're at home and there's a run club just down the street. So I can get to that run club. It's not, I've got to do it by myself. And to your point, that community helps with the motivation, but you've brought the run club closer to people. So for me, that's as much as anything a distribution type solution. And you're right, marketing's not just advertising, marketing is distribution as well. And there's more to it than just being widely distributed. But that distribution piece, that physical availability piece is really important. So for me, it sounds like you did a fabulous job of building physical availability for running by developing run clubs, which is a really cool
back
solution.
in the days, yeah. From there, I'll move to physical availability and making sure, which means you make sure that a brand is easier to buy. And this is a key pillar at the Institute, and also Byron Sharp is a big believer of mental and physical availability as well. So as people are shifting to e-commerce still, do you think physical stores still play an important role for some sectors especially?
Yeah, and it's just worth making the point that physical availability is not just about bricks and mortar stores. Physical availability is the purchase environment. You know, mental and physical availability are like a really nice corollary for each other, that they support each other. But then you get the problem, people are like, well, physical availability just means a physical store. No, it's actually referring to purchase environments in general. Traditionally, that was physical stores, but these days, absolutely, it includes online purchasing environments. Online matters. It matters a lot more in some categories than other categories. I think in the US, on average, about 13% of consumer products are sold online. So if you don't know what it is in your category, take it as 13%. In some categories, it's a lot higher. Some categories, it's a lot lower. Your investment in online should reflect the importance of online to your category, maybe plus a bit because it's growing. But if online is 13% of sales and you're putting 50% of your effort into the online channel, you're missing a huge proportion of potential sales. At the end of the day, you need coverage. You need coverage with your products, so your products suit the reasons why people are buying the category, and you need coverage of purchase environments. Are you in those places where people are making purchases? Now, it might be that just doing online is perfectly good for you because you've got limited capacity. You can't sell to everyone because you can't make enough product in whatever context that product is. But if you want to grow, you're going to need to make more product and sell to more people, which means you've got to think about more channels. So yeah, I think online absolutely it has value, but it's really easy to go overweight online because it's new, sexy and exciting. And that's a perennial problem with marketing, that it's always easy to go overweight in something that's new because it's new, sexy and exciting. And you've got to constrain yourself and keep your eye on the game, which is the hero channels, your hero products, your hero activities, and try some things around the side, but don't go overweight.
Yeah. And also, like, some of my clients are on the FMCG industry in the market. And what I see, especially for packaged goods, for packaged food type of product, I see that if they are trying the DTC through online only, like direct to consumer, and we want to do it online through our own shop, or sometimes they are trying Amazon as well, but it stagnates. I mean, like, it stops at a certain point. And the thing that I've been telling to them is that you have to be in the big, like, supermarkets like
100%.
Whole Foods, Walmart, or so on, so that people can see the product.
A lot of purchasing happens in those environments. And you're right, it's partly an advertisement. You're in store, people see you there, but just a ton of purchasing still happens in those environments. So if you're not there, you have no potential of being bought in those environments. You're not in the race. And you've got to be in the race. And
also, like, building brand awareness is like, it happens a lot at the physical stores. That's what I see. I
think to your point, in some categories, online is more important. But in a lot of categories, in most categories, the physical world still matters. Like, having storefronts helps. Motor vehicles, a lot of search happens online for finding motor vehicles, but people still want to test drive. They still want to go and kick tires. They're still going to go and touch it and poke it and prod it. And so, and you still got to deliver the product somewhere as well. So those physical environments really do matter in lots of categories.
Yeah. I would like to ask you about segmentation, because when we say mental availability, physical availability, I know that I've read a lot about this at the Institute and your research. Does it matter to go really niche in the segmentation, like, meaning that making the ads quite targeted rather than going broad?
Yeah, and I think niche can have value if your current capacities are constrained. But if you have capacity to build product or deliver service, you need to reach outside of small niches. And the niche was kind of talking about here is it might be a small geographic region, it might be just advertising through a particular media channel. That's fine if that's what your capacity allows, but growth in the long run means reaching pretty much everyone that buys the category. And a big mistake I see marketers doing quite often is deciding who's not going to buy their product for them, instead of, here's our product, you might like to buy it, and let somebody choose not to buy you, as opposed to, we're not even going to show you our product or get it in front of you because you're not going to buy it. Now, you might make that decision of they're not a category buyer. That makes a lot of sense. But if they are a category buyer and you're choosing not to sell to them, that's a potential, that is actually a limitation. You need to try and sell to more people, to the extent your capacity allows you to do so, of course. I mean, capacity constraints are an enormous issue.
Mm-hmm. And also, like, in terms of focusing too niche, it's at the end of the day, you are doing an assumption that someone will not buy your product.
Yeah, that's right. Don't make that assumption.
Yeah, I mean, like, of course you can do like the pricing if your price is quite high, and then you just don't want to go to the real low demographic. It's okay. That's not like, at the end of the day, a very niche segmentation. But this is a very big discussion in between marketers. I mean, shall we do?
But there's an interesting thing around
ads or so on.
Yeah, being premium and high price, like Apple, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds still buy Apple products because occasionally people buy up and they want the really nice product. So Apple's job is to go, we've got a premium product, it's a fabulous product, and show it to as many people as possible and let people have the opportunity to buy them, and not say, we're not going to advertise to this part of the country because it's too poor and they're not going to buy it. Because the chances are there's people in that part of the country that will buy your product. So why wouldn't you communicate with them?
I mean, in the country that I'm from, it's Turkey, and people love Apple, and well, it's in the world. But I know people that they are taking loans just to be able to buy Apple. And then, when you think about they are working for minimum wage and so on. I mean, that's how it is.
And whether or not that's a good idea is another question for that person. But from Apple's point of view, they should be advertising to people because people will buy up. They'll buy an expensive product because it might be that is the most expensive product they can buy. They're not going to buy a Mercedes, but they can buy an Apple product, and that will be their treat for self.
My next question is about the assets, like the distinctive assets of a brand. The importance of building distinctive assets rather than relying on emotional connections or storytelling, because storytelling is something that everyone is talking about, like purpose-driven marketing, storytelling, and so on. How can brands identify which assets are important for them? Is it the logo or creatives?
Yeah, so that's a consumer question. So the brand managers can have an opinion, but unless those brand managers are buying $1 billion worth of product a year, that opinion has limited value. So you can have the opinion, you can say, well, let's test these assets. Here's a set of assets we'll test. Like you can test 20 different things, stick it into market, into a consumer research piece, show people those assets and parts of those assets, and ask them what brand comes to mind when you see this asset. And that is a cold, hard way of doing it. It simply comes down to what is in the minds of millions of consumers in your country or in your category. That's what matters. And if an asset is, trends change, a new brand manager comes in, they stop using a jingle, they stop using that particular character we used for 20 years. If that asset is still strong and you haven't used it for 5 years, bring it back. If it's an inappropriate asset, society more has changed, well, then you're not going to bring that back. But if it's an asset that you just stopped using because a new brand manager decided to do something new, just bring it back in.
Yeah.
Things remain in memory for a long time. And it is fundamentally a consumer question. What do your consumers know you for? Now, you have a reasonable idea because you know what you've been doing over the last couple of years, but not everything sticks. And sometimes you think, we've been really supporting this asset, but it hasn't done that well. And this other asset we haven't supported so well, that's doing really well. Well, let's start supporting that one. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's fundamentally a consumer question. And the storytelling and brand purpose and those sorts of things are really interesting, and emotions. So storytelling and emotions in advertising are about capturing attention. So you're not trying to tell a story about the brand. You're telling a story that the brand is involved in to draw attention to the brand. You're using emotional hooks in advertising, not because you're trying to link that emotion to the brand, but because you want to get attention with that. You use kids and puppies and things like that in advertising to get attention and attractive people, but that attention has to be delivered to the brand at the end of the day. So the brand has to be integrated in it. So there's absolutely a place for storytelling and emotions, but it's about capturing it's not as much attention as you can, it's capturing some attention, but importantly, surrendering that attention to the brand itself. And that's the really critical piece.
Is there any research that you are working on right now? Interesting one that's going to come up soon.
We've done the brand purpose piece. We've done some work on recently, not me personally, but so we'll certainly have some findings in that space about the value of brand purpose for consumer buying. And there's a little sneak peek, it's not much. Brand purpose can have other value for business, but generally it doesn't have that much impact on consumer purchasing because consumers are making quick and dirty decisions. They're relying on that fast, good enough solution for right now, not investigating absolutely every reason why I might buy this brand. Some of the research I'm looking at the moment is identifying how different product attributes contribute to the loyalty of a particular product. And a product is a bundle of attributes, it's a bundle of benefits. how do different parts of that product contribute to the loyalty of that product itself generates. And of course, back to the earlier conversation we're having about price elasticities, higher loyalty means lower price elasticity for that product, especially when you raise price because people really like it. And again, it's that behavioral loyalty. What drives higher behavioral loyalty?
Mm-hmm. Such as like there's a bakery very close to my house and they only sell non-refined sugar bakeries. And that's the brand attribute that makes me loyal to that, because I know that whenever I go there, it's going to be kind of a healthier type of
that's
sugar
right.
content.
It's a bit less processed, so it's not quite as bad. I like that. Yes.
And I don't care about their brand purpose. Like,
no.
Although it doesn't mean that I don't care about the world or whatever, but I like how they use the products itself.
And brand purpose can matter for some people some of the time, but for most people, most of the time, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so it's not to say it never has value, but most of its value is going to be for other things for the business. So it might be around staff retention, it might be around corporate social responsibility, it can be all those sorts of things. But in terms of the cold calculus of how much impact does this have on consumers in general, probably not a lot.
Yeah. And it's a hard one when you're trying to, when companies try to put the brand purpose as well as the ESG, like corporate responsibility, as well as the environmental things, as a communication item on top of marketers' table. Because once you start doing that, it means that you are doing it for the purpose of increasing sales, because marketing is creating demand. So that's why I, for most of the companies, I always advise that just keep it separate. And this has to have its own communication line, not under the marketing communication, because it contradicts at the end of the day.
But it's got to be well branded when you do communicate it. Branding for me is primary. It's always the first message.
I agree to that. 2 questions that I ask every guest, which is the fun part now, because one of them is about coffee, which I know Australia is really good in coffee. I haven't been to Adelaide, but I've been to Sydney and Melbourne, which were one of the best coffees in the world. What's your favorite coffee place in the place that you live in, Adelaide, right?
Yes. And just to bring up your point about coffee, I think coffee is one of, oddly enough, Australia's great economic exports to the world. Obviously, we didn't develop coffee, and we've just picked it up and done a really good job. And maybe it's a terribly patriotic thing to do, but I find when I travel, if I find an Australian or New Zealand coffee shop, they always do good coffee. But in Adelaide, my favourite coffee shop, where this coffee itself came from this morning, is the West Oak Deli Cafe, which is right next to the university where I work. So if ever you're in Adelaide, you should come visit us and I'll take you for a coffee there, because they do great coffee. And it's funny because it's basically in a pub, and a pub is a bar in the US. It's the best coffee you'll get in a pub in Australia, I would argue, and it's a very good coffee.
Oh, that's good. I mean, the only thing that I know about Adelaide is there's a very worldwide known global trainer. I forget her name. She's from Adelaide, and she does the branding for Adelaide for me, actually. If you could recommend one business book, what would it be?
Well, I'd probably be a bit remiss if I didn't mention Byron Sharp's How Brands Grow, the first book that he wrote, and I think it was 2010 now. And sometimes people say, it's a bit old, it's a bit out of date. It's talking about fundamentals in consumer behaviour which haven't changed in the last 60 years. These patterns that are in that book have been observed over different countries, different times, different categories. Human behaviour doesn't change that much because it's about how our brain works. Now, the book is about the expression of that human behaviour, and it has some really critical findings for marketing, and I would absolutely recommend that. But I'd also, as just a chuck in a second book, and it's not really a business book, but Oliver Burkeman's 4,000 Weeks, I think is fabulous because it reminds us to focus on the things that matter. And there's a lot of stuff in marketing that doesn't matter quite as much as we like to anticipate. So we've got to be really clear about what matters in marketing and what doesn't, just like we need to be clear about what matters in life and what doesn't. So that'd be the two. If I can sneak in 2 books, that'd be the 2.
I read both books, and for me, I'm reading 1 book per week, and then I can say that Byron Sharp's book is still in the top
Classic.
3 always for any book that I could recommend. Carl, thanks so much for joining me on a very early Monday morning. I hope you enjoyed our coffee chat, although I'm not drinking coffee right now. I'm just
I certainly am.
giving ginger tea right now.
Thanks, Ida. It was lovely to meet you. Lovely to chat.